Bonjour everyone, my name is Nia and that's my first video in English on YouTube. Sounds promising, doesn't it? Today we'll talk about the most important book discoveries I have made over the past 6 years that I can recommend to you. And more broadly, we'll talk about my philosophical formation. I think that will give you a clear idea of what this channel will be about and what topics I'm exploring here. Spoiler, it's history, psychology, and of course philosophy. So that's why the list of books will consist of non-fiction and will be quite subjective, but I believe at least some of them can change your worldview just as they changed mine. I think we can divide all these books into 6 intellectual movements that have fascinated me since I was 18, I guess, and I even realized that they can be arranged into Kierkegaard's 3 stages of existence. First, the aesthetic stage, expressed through 19th century romanticism, especially Lautreamont, where I'm captivated by the tension between the grotesque and the sublime, by intensity, beauty, and form. Then the ethical stage, where through existentialism I begin asking questions about responsibility, choice, and freedom with Pascal, Frankl, and Eger. At the same time, here explore feminism, anarchism, and philosophical pessimism, questioning sexuality, rebellion, and death with Simone de Beauvoir, Stirner, Cioran, and Mainlander. And finally, the religious stage, now in which I am, and through traditionalist thinkers such as Guenon, I am trying to rediscover the sacred dimension of being within the chaos of the modern world. So let's look at each of these in more detail. Twenty 2021 was my first year of university. I had only begun discovering philosophy, especially ancient one, but even back then that period already felt alien to me. I realized that the 19th century was spiritually closer to me, and I began searching for its authors. What fascinates me about this era is how accurately it anticipates our own world, a world dominated by scientism and deprived of the sacred. The 19th century speaks through novelists. It says, "Where there are no gods, ghosts reign." It tells us that the living, unified sense of the divine disappears, and its place is taken by ghosts, imitation or simulacrums of the sacred, like science, technology, the idea of progress. This is what the poets and writers of the 19th century rebelled against. In their work, they immerse themselves in sexuality, organic movement, dynamism, transcendence, everything that contradicted the spirit of their age. Such were the German romantics, such as Goethe, novelists, Schlegel brothers, and also the French poets mudites, such as Maldoror, Rimbaud, Baudelaire, and especially Lautreamont. His work, The Sons of Maldoror, I would say is an absolutely brilliant one. Lautreamont, or Isidore Ducas, wrote it in the 1860s as a young, unknown boy from Montevideo. He composed it in a Paris hotel room, in total loneliness, accompanied only by piano and the atmosphere of a fever approaching the city, which, unfortunately, would soon kill him. But, even despite his early death and the fact that the book was banned from publication because of its radical nature, it didn't remain unnoticed. The avant-garde and the surrealists recognized its value. They called Lautréamont perhaps the most outspoken rebel and an apologist of evil, a prophet of ontological and artistic revolution. Paul Éluard compared him to Desailles, and Antonin Artaud to Baudelaire or Edgar Poe. So, you may ask, what is so special about the Sons of Maldoror? And I would say, most likely you will encounter a madness and a violence so poetically, proactively, grotesquely written that you have never seen anything like that before. I think the very act of Lautréamont reading will already seem to you an act of literary decadence, of sophisticated decay. You might think, oh, this work is just, romantic satanism, just another 19th century Gothic novel. But it's not just darkness. It's a parody of darkness, a parody of Gothic novel itself, a blackness turned inside out. So, the main character, Maldoror, I would say is a figure of absolute negation, anti-humanism, pure evil. He speaks only the language of cruelty, so he kills, he rapes, he mocks animals, humans, and even God. Even God. That is for Lautreamont. The entire world becomes an object of continuous destruction. Thus, evil is radicalized to such a degree that any justification for the existence of the world, humanity, or God just stops working. The human being ceases to be the center and measure of all things and becomes only pathetic torn material in torture, something devoid of value. In this way, I would say Lautreamont destroys classical anthropology, in the same way he destroys classical theodicy. So, it says, God is good. Therefore, the world created by him is also good. Evil is a lack of good, or a trial on the path toward good. So evil always has meaning. Lautreamont, he overturns that. He asks, what if evil has no meaning? What if it leads nowhere and is just a fact of matter itself? Then what is the role of God? What does he do? He just loses his moral function and becomes compromised by the world. So his existence, if he truly exists, explains nothing and justifies nothing. God becomes deprived of any meaning. And I would say this brings Lautreamont very close to nihilism, because the absence of meaning, the void of meaning, is nothingness. Lautreamont was not the only one to say that in 19th century. The philosophical pessimists, such as Philipp Mainlander and Emil Cioran, radicalized the idea of God as nothingness even further. That's actually a very extraordinary parallel. I'm quite sure you will hardly hear it anywhere else on the internet. It's more like my personal observation. So, what I noticed is that Mainlander philosophically systemizes what Lautreamont expresses poetically through aesthetic images. Their use are strangely similar in the destruction of theodicy, in the compromise of God, and even in understanding being itself as a process of decay. And the most surprising thing here is that these authors never met and didn't even know of each other's existence. Yet they began writing so similar ideas almost in the same year, in 1868, when both the Sons of Maldoror and Mainlander's philosophy of redemption were born. For this reason, I would even recommend you reading these books together. However, I should warn you, Mainlander is much more complex and requires at least some philosophical background, especially knowing of Schopenhauer and Kant, because he constructs an entire metaphysical system based on their teachings. If we look at it briefly, for Mainlander, God truly is nothingness, because God committed suicide. That's my favorite topic. From this act, the world was born as the decomposing remains of his corpse, and God is now finally dying within each of us, even in me. Yet he writes, since we are ruled by the will toward death, because being is suffering and therefore evil, while non-being is good, obviously, that means the death of God is also good, even a liberation. Our task is to free ourselves from existence, following God's example through suicide. Here I would say Mainlander reached the ontological limit, unlike Lautreamont. And of course he has other influences, namely the irrationalism of Schopenhauer, when for Lautreamont these are mainly romantic poets and writers, so he parodies them, distorts them, exaggerates them into absurdity, which is why we can find him playing with the lines of Baudelaire, Hugo, de Musset, Lamartine, Blake, and Goethe. I would say both authors deserve your attention. You see, they break our basic assumptions about the world and humanity's central place within it. They show that beauty can be cruel, that God can be empty, and that humanism can be fragile. We may want to naively believe that the world must be good, meaningful, humane, yet they allow us to look at it without these illusions. And to me, this, along with the sheer radicality of their thought, is what fascinates most. Perhaps that's why these books never appear in school or university reading programs, and why they are spoken about so rarely, but they are certainly capable of prompting us to deep reflection. My next discovery was existentialism, but of course not so much as mainstream authors of the last century like Sartre or Camus, but its predecessor, Blaise Pascal. You probably know him as the inventor of the syringe and the mechanical calculator like the Pascaline, which ultimately made modern computing possible. Fun fact, even the phone or laptop you're watching this video on right now exists thanks to Pascal. His name is also associated to the units of pressure, to the Pascal programming language, and even early ideas of public transportation and urban parks. But you won't believe it, that's not even the only thing Pascal is known for. In his later years, he wrote Pensées or Thoughts, one of the earliest existential texts in history, and he stood against the entire spirit of his era, the 17th century, obsessed with scientism, same was with the Romantics we already discussed. That's why Pascal was seen as an enfant terrible of this age, and in academic circles inspired by Descartes, he was largely avoided. Why was there such a difference between them? Descartes insisted that the human being is an active subject, both of knowledge and of transforming reality. He famously claimed that there is nothing so distant that cannot be reached, and nothing mysterious that cannot be discovered. All through, of course, reason. So, humanity, for Descartes, could become master of nature. This is, a kind of epistemological optimism. Pascal was first to say, no, that's not true. He realized that science and Descartes himself overlooked the limits of human knowledge. Pascal therefore describes the human being as both miserable and great at once. He says, physically, we are lost in time and space. A human life of 100 years cannot compare to the universe or its millennia of existence. But we are great because we can grasp this entire universe with our thinking, our thoughts, while the universe cannot do that. It cannot think. So from this Pascal derives ethical imperative. If our greatness lies in thinking, then we must think well, because thinking becomes the basis of human moral dignity. For him, scientific knowledge alone without this imperative cannot save us from existential emptiness. Science doesn't give ethical orientation. It cannot answer what it means to be human in this universe, nor how to live while recognizing our misery. Therefore, thinking cannot remain an instrument of science. It's something greater, our dignity, and that's why our moral duty. For this reason, I think Pensées can serve as a kind of existential guide. It helps us not escape reality, but face it. We are usually frightened by thoughts of death, by cosmic insignificance and meaninglessness. So we distract ourselves with noise, with entertainment, and comforting illusions. Pascal awakens us from this and forces us to confront the fracture directly. That's what I admire most about him. Though, to be honest, his views were ignored for a long time, until the early 20th century, when the influence of Enlightenment rationalism and positivism began to fade. So, at least I'm glad we are back to talking about his ideas now. The 20th century in general was extremely fruitful for existential thinkers. I especially want to mention Viktor Frankl, the founder of logotherapy or existential psychotherapy, and Edith Eger, his follower. They are both wonderful people, but with very, very difficult experiences of Nazi concentration camps. So you can imagine, their ideas were literally born from pain and suffering in Auschwitz and Dachau. I personally have immense respect for and compassion for them. After all, these people witnessed death, and if these ideas help them resist evil within their own minds, endure the pressure of Nazi officers, and eventually survive, then for me personally, that's a really powerful argument. Perhaps the idea that stayed with me the most since 2022, when I first began reading Frankl, is the idea of values. Frankl generally argued that the most important task in life is the realization of one's unique meaning. This meaning already exists in the world. All that remains for us is to find it. There are 3 ways to do it. First, through creation. What we give to life, what we produce, like poetry, music, painting, and so on. Second, it's about experiential values, what life gives to us, what we feel, what inspires our creativity, like love, encounters with nature, beauty, and so on. And third, our attitude toward all of it, toward life itself, how we look at our failures, how we look at our pain, our disappointments. What is fascinating is that we can be deprived of creative values. For example, if we lose our hands or eye vision and can't paint anymore, or we can be deprived of experiential values if we are locked in a room, for example. But Frankl says, no one can ever take away our attitudinal values, the freedom to choose our stance toward situation. As Edith Eger said, no one can see what is inside our mind. And so she, only a year early a ballerina, now a 16-year-old prisoner in Auschwitz, she dances in front of Josef Mengele himself. He expects that she will break and beg on her knees for a piece of bread, but she keeps her dignity, because she chose how she would relate to it. And he could do nothing about that. He couldn't enter her mind. So, you can read more stories like this in Eger's books called The Choice and the Gift, as well as Viktor Frankl's Man Searching for Meaning. I have already a video about that, but it's in Ukrainian, so if you understand Ukrainian, you're welcome to watch it. And I hope I will also be able to add English subtitles to make it accessible to a wider audience, but I'm still thinking about it. In 2023, a major discovery for me was Simone de Beauvoir's work called The Second Sex. At that time, I perceived feminism as a very radical, critical, and even unsuccessful movement because I grew up in an atmosphere of general misogyny and insecurity for women. Moreover, in philosophy courses we spoke exclusively about male philosophers. Simone de Beauvoir was mentioned only in conversations about Sartre's biography. That's ridiculous. So I asked myself, why did that happen? And I found the answer precisely in The Second Sex. This work can rightly be called one of the most significant books of 20th century, where de Beauvoir explores the place and role of women in modern society, gender inequality, and female identity itself. It contains philosophical, historical, biological, and literary references. Already in the introduction, de Beauvoir tries to define femininity and reveals that it means a kind of Lacanian otherness. A woman is not just not a man, but also historically not fully man, in the meaning human, not fully human. The word human itself emerged relatively late as a reaction to this identification. That's why a woman was treated as something fundamentally other, a deviation from the norm, from a man, from human. So she is not an opposite, equal to man, but something secondary. And this perception, as de Beauvoir says, allowed men to retain power. From this arise several questions. So first, when did that happen? How and why? Second, why did we begin speaking about it only recently? And third, what can women do about it? So de Beauvoir answers this step by step while also entering into polemic with the major theories of her time, Freud, Adler, and Marx. The last of these was the most interesting to me personally. So, de Beauvoir recognizes that women's social position depends on economic structure. Moreover, modern women achieved equality precisely through labor, because labor ergo sum, unfortunately. And even the first to propose an International Women's Day were socialist activists Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg. But de Beauvoir disagrees that Marxism in many ways, especially with the thought that the invention of new tools of labor and the need for heavy physical strain became a historical defeat of the female sex. She says that a man needed the services of other men, who could intensively cultivate the fields with a plow. Therefore, they became his slaves, the first private property, and so did women. But Beauvoir replies that's not a sufficient explanation. Conquest instincts, the male desire to dominate, also was important. Otherwise, the invention of bronze tools would have produced cooperation between men and women rather than hierarchy, but that didn't happen. So, she even complements this idea. This desire to dominate harms men themselves. If men construct a woman as an other, as an object, in order to have this superiority, then how can they seek recognition from her? Recognition from an unequal being can't validate them, truly appreciate their personalities. That's why arises an existential dead end, an existential loneliness. Secondly, if man is the master, he constantly needs to confirm this status and spend energy on maintaining this hierarchy and controlling women, and that's exhausting. Third argument, even law itself becomes deformed. It turns into a battlefield for domination rather than union of two equal people. To the reasons Beauvoir gives, I would add another. If men didn't have monopoly in all areas of science, including history, we would not only remember the names of all women inventors today, but we would have 100 times more of them. And we wouldn't possess such a one-sided view of history. The 17th century French courtesan feminist Pauline de la Barre said, "All that has been written about women by men should be suspect, for the men are at once judge and party to the lawsuit." Because when men write about the nature of women, they write not as objective scientists, but an interested party who wants to preserve their privilege, their power, and at the same time the one who makes the decision, that is, the judge. That's why de Beauvoir concludes, the history of humanity has been the history of only half of humanity. Women can now change that by becoming free, through economic independence from men, through work, through participation in science, art, and politics, rather than locking themselves in domestic life, through solidarity with men. And I want to emphasize, not struggle against them. And finally, by refusing to see themselves as another, as an equal, because this is only a social construct. That's why one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. During all this time, I kept exploring the problem of freedom. As we saw, for Pascal, freedom was internal, like the dignity of thinking opposed to the limits of reason. And for de Beauvoir, freedom became external, through the body, language, history against external structures of oppression. But I found one thinker for whom freedom became unconditional. That's Max Stirner. It seems to me that Stirner's work, called The Ego on its Own, is not widely known, even I would say in philosophical circles. Why? Maybe because it resists classification within any movement. The same could be said of the thinkers I already mentioned, like Pascal, Kierkegaard, Mainlander, Cioran. But I am sure the things Stirner wrote about can still be useful for us. In The Ego on its Own, Stirner tried to affirm the individual will, to manifest the ego and liberate it, in particular through rebellion against idea fictions, or spooks, which threatened the uniqueness of the individual and placed themselves above the individual will. This includes everything: the collective, unlike Marx, the state, society, freedom, morality, humanity, and even language itself. Language for Stirner is filled with abstractions and hanging over the individual, actually the same ones produced by German philosophy, like Fichte's ego, Hegel's spirit, and Feuerbach's man. And it's not only language, even the idea of the individual's liberation from these ideas is itself another spook. So for Stirner, individual freedom, as I said, is unconditional. It doesn't need to justify itself. It is the individual inherent property. And that's precisely what follows rebellion. The individual manifests the ego not only by rebellion, but by appropriating the world. What does this mean? So, we are interested here not so much in the objects of the external world as objects of our possession, as Marx would say in materialism probably, but in our power with which we acquire them. So, we can be deprived of objects, but never be deprived of power. Moreover, this power must even be directed toward ourselves. This was an interesting conclusion I reached in my university research. So the individual must become the owner even of one's ego, multiplying own force. That's why the Delphic maxim, know thyself, in Stirner sounds more like use thyself, or even return to thyself. By the way, do you know why this idea is especially valuable today? It prevents us from becoming slaves to the ideology. At least that's my opinion. That's an essential feature of modernity. Ideology reigns everywhere. It reigns in ready-made popular positions when we believe it and stop asking questions. This applies not only to political views, as you can assume, but to everyday life. For example, why, when we are asked to introduce ourselves, why do we always begin by describing our profession? But our social roles, like what I do for a living, are not equal to my identity. For Stirner, that's a classic case of substitution, the domination of a spook idea over the individual. That's why he says we must overcome the alienation imposed on us by these spooks. We need to conduct an inner revaluation of values, which is definitely in tune in Nietzsche. So Stirner says we need to rise above all ideologies through rebellion. In this way, we can overthrow not only institutions of oppressions, state or religious structures, for example, but overthrow the very ideas behind them, so that we can prevent the replacement of one system of domination by another. For this reason, Stirner's project is often called anarcho-individualism, and the ego on its own became a model of political and artistic rebellion for many avant-garde movements of the 20th century. But I think this work deserves the attention of modern people as well. In 2025, I finally encountered the ideas of Emil Cioran. His reflections emerged after the two world wars, and through them humanity had already seen the large-scale sacrifices to which the power of ideas could lead. That's why Cioran actually became a witness to the world that Stirner described, and he, like a wise, searched for ways to escape the kingdom of ideas. So, Cioran is also an anti-academic figure, a hermit. He had no university career, no own school, no disciples, and he never called himself a philosopher, only a skeptic. But what he wrote about, and in what form, fascinated me deeply. Cioran is a master of laconic, elegant aphorisms and essays. Here he was probably inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche. What he is writing about? So, in his works, just like Lautreamont or Mainlander, he claims that ontologically, non-being has the same rights as being, because everything that exists is sooner or later doomed to death. So, you see, he already thinks outside of the box, I would say. He builds his own method of skepticism, but this method is existential, because Cioran stands not only against ideologies or philosophical systems, as Stirner did, but against the very grounds that justify our existence. Because absurdity, or rather the very awareness of the absurdity of our existence, of being thrown into the world, is our salvation. He says it frees us from the excessive pressure of ambition, of success, and even from the fear of death itself. For Cioran, success not only breeds self-satisfaction, success distances us from ourselves. True self-knowledge begins when a person fails and reaches rock bottom. That's not the only cool idea he has. Cioran also says that the fear of death is not justified because life brings more horror than death. Life is a process and death is just a moment. He even develops this idea further and says, our timing is wrong. The real catastrophe is not our end, but our beginning. We do not rush toward death. We flee from the catastrophe of birth. The best thing, by the way, that helps us escape it is awareness of the possibility of suicide. Paradoxically, Cioran claims that suicide helps us live rather than die. The understanding that you may live at any moment gives you a sense of control and freedom, and this makes your daily existence more bearable. The same applies to suffering. We are used to think that suffering is evil and therefore must be immediately justified by some lesson we can extract from it. But Cioran says, suffering or pain is not evil. The evil lies in the demand that our suffering must necessarily have meaning. This is what modern humanity constantly does, and therein lies its tragedy. It wants to rationalize suffering. If instead we made suffering an end in itself, we would feel relief. Because suffering exposes naked reality and dismantles every hope for the future. It isolates us and removes social mass, so we don't need to lie to ourselves or others. Finally, it allows catharsis and awakening from metaphysical sleep. That means seeing the tragic nature of the world and finding relief in ceasing to struggle against truth. So, as you can see, Cioran turns many of our traditional beliefs upside down. He has very atypical, paradoxical train of thought that distinguishes him from any other existential thinker, and that's precisely what may attract you as well. Here I would recommend his first work, On the Heights of Despair, and his last, Confessions and Anathemas. The last book we will talk about, and one I began reading only recently, is The Crisis of Modern World by Rene Guenon. That's also philosophy, but you will be surprised. That's interesting philosophy, because this work contradicts in many ways every book I have mentioned today. Why? Because it belongs to integral traditionalism, and Guenon was the first to systematize its ideas. They are, by the way, also very relevant today. So I will try to explain them as simply as possible. So, according to Guenon, when the world first emerged and religions were born, humanity encountered the truth of the universe through the divine. That's what he calls primordial revelation. But since all people are different, they understood and transmitted this primordial knowledge, Sophia perennis, in different ways. So he says, religions are historically different, but ontologically true forms of this knowledge. However, Guenon continues, now we experience the decline of these religions. That means the decline of primordial knowledge, and that's why we see the crisis of the modern world. The problem is that our world is dominated by science with a cult of reason, instead of religion with its intellectual intuition. Our modern world is full of materialization, practicality, fragmentation, multiplicity, diversity, speed, change, action. Here, individualism replaces unity in the universal metaphysical principle, and in general we see the secular replaces the spiritual. Guenon criticized that. For him, that's the point at which the world enters the Kali Yuga, the last age of cosmological cycle in Hinduism, the age of the demon Kali, the worst one. It's characterized by the greatest degree of degeneration and the furthest distance from first principles. Overall, there are 4 such ages: Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and finally Kali Yuga. In each of them, there is a gradual spiritual and moral degradation of humanity. The amount of dharma, moral virtue, decreases by a quarter with each new age. That's why in Kali Yuga it's only 25%. How it started? So, back in 3102 BCA, Krishna, the embodiment of dharma, died and ceased restraining Kali. That's the moment when chaos engulfed the world. Great volcanoes erupted. Climatic winter arrived, harvests failed, and nature became hostile to humanity. We have already spent more than 5,000 years in this period, and still remain in it. Nature still remains hostile to us, and instead of moving towards spiritual perfection, instead of returning to dharma as in the first age, Satya Yuga, humanity chooses to conquer nature, to subordinate nature through technology and exploit it. Why? Because Guenon says human intellect is now directed not towards seeking truth, which is suprahuman and higher, but it directed toward seeking convenient justification in matter for human wishes, desires. So, Guenon concludes, modern people, instead of rising toward truth, try to drag truth down to their own level. Here he means the level of matter. Everything higher is reduced to lower, the divine to the human, heaven to earth, when the vertical axis should be on the contrary not descending but ascending, moving upward from below. Because even the light comes from above. If we search for truth in the lower layers, like in science concerned only with matter, then we sink deeper into the darkness of the Kali Yuga, unfortunately. But I would say we really do. Guenon writes, we are still by default convinced of the dictatorship of science. We immediately declare anything beyond scientific knowledge unknowable. We stop asking about God. We become indifferent. We imagine only what can be measured, calculated, or weighed. We have reduced quality to quantity and become a reign of quantity, as Guenon calls it. And more than that, we have become its slaves. Earlier, when quality prevailed, the making of any object contained ritual, uniqueness, the investment of one's soul. The ancient craftsman was a creator. Now it's completely the opposite. We produce enormous numbers of identical goods in identical ways, being not creators, but only additions to their real creators, machines. We are absorbed by the profane. Will it be able to absorb us entirely? Guenon believed such a fate may indeed await Western civilization, but as long as the East exists, preserving a traditional spirit and not fully westernized, hope remains, at least for Guenon. For me personally, this work is great. It continues the discussion of spiritual declines that we began at the beginning of this video when we talked about the 19th century. And since then, many of the books I mentioned resonate and contradict with Guenon at the same time. I would say they are also anti-scientistic, through they approach this criticism not from tradition, but from existence. For example, Blaise Pascal, Simone de Beauvoir, and Emil Cioran. De Beauvoir, however, would clearly not agree with Guenon, since he saw women's emancipation as a project of modernity, and I think as a project of decline, because this equality means the absence of hierarchy. And of course, Guenon would say the same about the individualism of Max Stirner. But even despite that, I still believe that the crisis of the modern world has a particular relevance today. You will see that some of Guenon's prophecies from 1927 have indeed come true, and you may gain a new perspective on history thanks to that. That's all for today. We tried to delve into both simple and complex books, both philosophy and psychology, and I hope I was able to tell you something new. So please write in the comments below which book interested you the most and why. If you want to see more videos like this, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you and see you soon!